Hey Raiders, good morning. Mr. Swanson here. We're doing an at-home learning day, and I've sent home a reading packet. What I want to do is read that packet to you. For those of you who prefer to listen, and here's an option for you to listen or right alongside the packet. So here is the packet. You get 6 pages of reading, pretty good reading level, pretty succinct and simple description of some of these topics that can be really important to us in class. So here we go. This is from GSE U.S. History, Chapter 3, The Expansion of the United States. Jacksonian Democracy refers to Andrew Jackson. One great supporter of Manifest Destiny was Andrew Jackson. He was a war hero who had defeated the British at New Orleans in 1814 and forced concessions from the Spanish that led to Florida becoming a U.S. territory in 1819. It became a state in 1845. In addition, Jackson was a common man. He was not born into the rich upper class, but instead had achieved success despite growing up relatively poor and uneducated. As a result, he was very popular with the western frontier settlers and the common folk. In 1824, he decided to take advantage of his popularity, and he ran for president. If I had popularity, I'd run for president too. A corrupt bargain. More than any previous election, the presidential election of 1824 was evidence of the sectional differences in the United States. New England backed the current Secretary of War, John Quincy Adams, while the Southern candidate was William Crawford of Georgia. Meanwhile, both Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were formidable Western candidates. The election came down to Adams and Jackson and was so close that the House of Representatives had to decide the winner. When Clay threw his support to Adams, it was enough to give the son of former President John Adams the victory. Jackson and his followers soon protested. However, when it was learned that Clay would be named Secretary of State, Jackson and his supporters denounced it as a corrupt bargain made to give Adams the presidency. 4 years later, however, Jackson defeated Adams to become the nation's president. The idea there is that Adams would win the presidency and Henry Clay would become the Secretary of State. It's like they agreed to share votes so that bargain could happen, a corrupt bargain. Universal white male suffrage. Jackson's brand of politics and the changes he inspired came to be known as Jacksonian democracy. Jackson believed strongly in Western expansion and the rights of white frontier settlers. He, like many Westerners, resented Eastern elites and political leaders who seemed to favor the upper class and passed laws Jackson believed helped the wealthy over small landowners. As a result, Jackson favored universal suffrage. In other words, he believed that all white men should be free to vote, not just those who owned property. With the support of men like Jackson, all but a few states dropped property requirements for voting. Expanding suffrage is the right to vote. Expanding suffrage made the nation more democratic and enabled simpler men like Jackson to win public office, rather than simply those from the upper class. It is important to remember, however, that even Jacksonian democracy did not attempt to extend the right to vote to women, African Americans, or Native Americans. The Nullification Crisis. In 1832, the state of South Carolina decided it needed to protect its state's rights by passing a Nullification Act. Nullification Acts allowed states to stop the interference of the federal government in state affairs and the right to nullify federal acts. Nullify means to do away with. South Carolina was angry that the federal government was collecting tariffs from the state. As a result, South Carolina declared that all tariffs from 1828 and 1832 were void or not applicable. John C. Calhoun, a South Carolina senator, was instrumental in the state defying the federal government. After this action, the Nullification Crisis became a confrontation between South Carolina and the federal government. The federal government struggled to find a solution that would satisfy both parties. President Jackson first retaliated by passing the Force Bill, which allowed the federal government to use whatever force necessary to overrule the state's actions. As expected, this action did not go over well with South Carolina. South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union. That means leave the Union. To prevent this, the tariff of 1833 was brought forward. The tariff reduced rates became 20% and introduced the concept of duty-free products and materials to the economy. Furthermore, the new act declared that tariffs must be paid in cash. War was prevented, staved off, but that didn't reduce the power of the federal government in the states. Indian removal. As mentioned earlier, Jackson believed in manifest destiny and westward expansion. Manifest destiny is the belief that the United States deserves to extend from sea to shining sea. We are meant to expand across the whole continent of North America. Manifest destiny. It's our destiny to occupy lands from sea to shining sea. So Jackson believed in manifest destiny and westward expansion. He saw the Native Americans that occupied territories to the west as an obstacle to be removed. As a result, he supported Indian removal. Under this policy, the U.S. government forced Native Americans off lands that it wanted for white settlement. Perhaps the most famous example of Jackson's support for this policy was his refusal to help the Cherokee in North Georgia and the Western Carolinas. Despite the fact that the Cherokee had helped Jackson defeat his enemies, the Creek, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend during the War of 1812, Jackson supported Georgia's efforts to remove the tribe from their lands during the 1830s. Cherokee helped Jackson during the War of 1812. Jackson doesn't help the Cherokee when they needed him in the 1830s. Jackson's policies ultimately led to the forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838. Their march west to Oklahoma became known as the Trail of Tears because many Cherokees suffered and died along the way. You all know I'm from Oklahoma. There's a lot of Indian heritage and history in Oklahoma, and I'm excited to talk about this a little bit more in class. Return of the two-party system. Sharp differences over the government's role in the economy and national development led to a break in the Jeffersonian Republican Party. Jackson's wing took on the name Democrats, while his opponents adopted the name National Republicans. Eventually, many of the National Republicans formed a new party, the Whigs, W-H-I-G-S. They chose this name because it was the name of the British party that opposed King George III during the Revolutionary War. Since they accused Jackson of acting like King Andrew, they adopted the name Whig as well. After an era of good feelings, James Monroe, remember, era of good feelings. After the era of good feelings, the two-party system returned to national politics with a vengeance. Jackson left office after a second term, allowing his vice president and fellow Democrat Martin Van Buren to win the presidential election of 1836. Interestingly enough, Van Buren's presidential campaign gave birth to the common expression, okay. It stood for Old Kinderhook, which was Van Buren's nickname. However, Andrew Jackson's enemies in the Whig Party turned it around and said that it stood for the way the uneducated common man president used to approve of executive papers with the initials OK, meaning all correct. Jackson's way of spelling all correct. How about that? Martin Van Buren and OK. Still with me? Henry Clay's American System. While the War of 1812 served to unite the nation, it also exposed the danger of relying too much on foreign imports. In 1824, Secretary of State Henry Clay proposed what he called the American System. Clay supported several measures he thought were crucial to improving the nation's economy and infrastructure. And infrastructure is what provides the framework and connections for holding something together. For instance, in the case of a country like the United States, infrastructure would include roads, rail lines, service and utilities, canals, and so on. Clay's plan called for such things as a protective tariff, a tax on imports, to help the U.S. manufacturing continue to grow and compete with other nations. Internal improvements, such as better canals and roadways funded by the federal government's tariff revenue, and a strong second national bank, the first one's charter had expired, in order to make interstate commerce easier and to stabilize the nation's currency. Clay believed this plan would serve to strengthen the United States and make it more economically independent. He also hoped that it would serve to unite the different regions of the country. The Industrial Revolution. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Western world experienced the Industrial Revolution. It was a time when advances in technology led to massive economic changes. Before the Industrial Revolution, national economies tended to rely on artisans, merchants, and farmers. As a result, manufacturing was often slow, as products had to be crafted individually and by hand. With industrialization, however, factories that relied on mechanization, or the use of machines, began to transform manufacturing and to replace manual labor with industry. The revolution began in Great Britain, but soon spread throughout the Western world, impacting trade and economies. Eli Whitney. The Industrial Revolution reached the United States as well. A number of inventions had great impact on America in the 1800s. One of the nation's most important figures was Eli Whitney. In 1793, he invented his famous cotton gin. The machine allowed people to process harvested cotton much faster, made in... Just kidding. Just a sec. Let me finish, okay? The machine allowed people to process harvested cotton much faster and made the South a cotton kingdom, nickname given to the South as cotton became its most profitable crop and the basis of the South's economy during the 1800s. Cash crop? Anybody? Cash crop? Many Southern plantation owners got rich as people in the United States and overseas demanded more cotton. Because the cotton gin led to a boom in cotton plantations, it also made the South more dependent on slave labor. So Eli Whitney and the cotton gin responsible for an increased demand in slave labor. While Whitney's cotton gin impacted the South, it was another of his innovations that transformed the economy of the North. After the cotton gin, Whitney began to manufacture muskets, guns. In this industry, he introduced the idea of interchangeable parts. For the first time, each part of the musket was produced with such precision that it could fit parts from any other musket. Whitney's concept of the interchangeable parts spread to other industries and became a key principle behind the industrial development. Impact of technology. Just one more page, okay? Impact of technology. Other men contributed to the U.S. industrialization as well. Samuel Slater helped introduce the idea of using machine manufacturing in factories to produce more goods in less time. Robert Fulton revolutionized the shipment of manufactured goods and agricultural products with his steam-powered boat. Meanwhile, Samuel Morse's telegraph, John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick's reaper helped make it possible to settle new territories in the West. The Industrial Revolution also had another unforeseen circumstance, sectionalism. Sectionalism refers to the economic, social, cultural, and political differences that exist between different parts of the country. Stop. As Whitney's cotton gin helped transform the South into a plantation system dependent on slaves and cotton, the North became a region dependent on factories and immigrant labor. Such economic differences caused strains on the nation that led to bitter disputes. Meanwhile, the West became a growing frontier of small landowners and aspiring plantation masters. The Industrial Revolution did more than transform the nation's economy. It set the nation on a course that ultimately led to westward expansion and civil war. Last page. The influences of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening happened during the mid-1820s. People in the ministry felt that Americans had become too interested in earning money and less interested in serving God. Many religious groups, like the Baptists and the Methodists, saw an increase in church members because of revivals. As a part of the awakening, many zealous Christian preachers traveled from revival to revival, preaching the gospel and calling on believers to become socially active and impact society through good works. As a result, religion motivated many to become social reformers. Others without strong religious beliefs became active simply to improve the world they lived in. Educational reform. Horace Mann was an influential American educator who advocated education reform. He wanted both men and women to have access to public education and believed that education was essential to the success of democracy. He helped create the State Board of Education in Massachusetts, the first of its kind in the United States. Such efforts in Massachusetts inspired other states to make reform in education. Temperance. During the early 19th century, the temperance movement gained popularity. Members of this movement wanted to moderate the use of alcohol. Later, they advocated total abstinence from alcohol and succeeded in convincing several states to pass laws prohibiting its sale. The temperance movement owed much of its success to the efforts of women and church leaders in the United States. Women's suffrage. Women had participated in the abolitionist and temperance movements only to face discrimination from men with whom they'd served. The offense these women suffered led to the birth of the women's rights movement. Women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped organize the first women's rights convention known as the Seneca Falls Conference in 1848. Stanton used the occasion to call for women's suffrage. That means women having the right to vote. Such boldness shocked many of her fellow activists. Although some felt Stanton went too far by demanding suffrage, the conference went a long way in drawing attention to the issue of women's rights. Another key figure was Susan B. Anthony. A supporter of both the temperance and abolitionist movements, Anthony is best known for joining with Elizabeth Cady Stanton to fight for women's rights. An active supporter of women's suffrage, Anthony would often deliver speeches written by Stanton while Stanton was busy with her young children. She continued to be a leader for the women's suffrage movement until her death in 1906. So this is your reading for today. You got what I'm collecting tomorrow is 2 pages. This Bill of Rights activity. So the Bill of Rights followed by 1, 2, and 3 practices based on the reading you just did. So there you have it. About to post this to Google Classroom. Audio companion for the assigned reading for today, September 1st, 2021. Horns up. Love you. Swanson out. See you on Google Meets in just a second.